You're listening to Arsenal for Democracy, episode 322, recorded on August 30th, 2020. I'm your host, Bill Humphrey. Joining me on the line from Cambridge, Massachusetts again is Nate. Hello, Nate.
Great to be here.
And joining me on the line from Washington, D.C. is Kelley. Hi, Kelley.
Hi, Bill. Hi, Nate.
So last week on the radio show, Nate and I had done an interview with the author of Don't Blame Us, talking about the 128 corridor and political transition of the suburbs around Boston in the 1960s, 70s, and onward, and how that affected the Democratic Party as a whole during that period. One of the things we talked about toward the end, although listening back to it, I'm wondering if we maybe didn't explain enough for people who are outside of the area here. We talked about the Metco busing program, which was a voluntary busing program that was adopted at the end of the 1960s and then grew over time, somewhat at least. That was voluntarily busing black students and then some Latino students and so forth from Boston into the very white, affluent suburbs of the 128 corridor. But this is, of course, part of a broader context of debates over busing for integration purposes in an involuntary way. And, of course, as we'll talk about later in this episode, Boston in particular was sort of a flashpoint nationally, but there was a lot of debate around this all around the country. Now, we're going to be talking about school buses on the whole and how they are a pretty significant force in decision-making in school policy and budgeting in general in the United States today. But because the ticket has now been announced for the Democrats this year, and Joe Biden, a former busing opponent, is on the ticket with Kamala Harris, the senator from California who grew up being in one of these busing programs for integration, it seemed like it'd be worthwhile to take a closer look at this particular topic. So Nate, could you briefly recap about the sort of the Biden-Harris thing and how that came up last year earlier in the presidential election? And then we'll go to Kelley to talk about some of the bus policy stuff today.
So if we all think back to that debate, was maybe the second debate, or it was pretty early on in the cycle. I remember it well. And of course, there was the line that appeared to be I don't know what it was set up, or there was some sort of pre-scripted thing, because she had shirts made with her face on it afterwards, but she is like talking about the busing, and she's like, actually, that little girl was me. So I'll tell you on this subject, it cannot be an intellectual debate amongst Democrats. We have to take it seriously. We have to act swiftly. And then Biden's like, oh, I actually didn't oppose busing. I had opposed Department of Education mandated busing. So then they did a little back and forth on that, and then she sold the shirts. And then there was a lot of investigation into Biden's actual history and what forms of busing did he oppose. And then there were some efforts from the Biden campaign to be like, oh, well, he supported these types of busing, but not these ones. So, but recently she was asked by ABC's Robin Roberts and said that the primary exchange was a distraction, and we're going to be moving on. So she also told Stephen Colbert in an interview before she was selected as vice president, as the nominee there, that it was a debate, and therefore I guess doesn't matter. So
all a game.
Yep.
Now, Kelley, before we get back into the history of it, I did want to talk about the sort of modern situation with busing, but you had raised an important point about the rhetoric around busing, because we're kind of talking about two different things distinctly here. There's the concept of busing itself, which we will talk about at some great depth in a moment. But there's also the question of this racial integration busing. But it can be kind of conflated in some ways, or like used to sort of obscure things, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think Nate will also talk about this a little bit later. But essentially, in some ways, the word busing, the fact that that's what we're talking about, and that's even what the Kamala Harris conversation focused on, that is a win for sort of the anti-desegregation camp, because busing was really just a way to enforce desegregation. still today, and certainly at the time of Brown v. Board, our neighborhoods were segregated, our housing was segregated, and so in order to really integrate schools, you were going to have to sort of move people around. And not just attend your neighborhood school. Although there are cases as well. One of the cases which had been rolled up into the Brown v. Board case was actually a student in Topeka, Kansas, who was arguing for his right to go to his neighborhood school, the school that was closest to him. So not always, but oftentimes purposeful desegregation was going to take people sort of moving across those neighborhood lines. And so busing is just one policy that could be used to address desegregation, as was ordered by the courts in Brown v. Board of Education.
Now, of course, these days, though, busing children to school, regardless of any integration steps, is necessary for many school districts just to physically get the kids to school. There's also been a move away from having the little local neighborhood schools and toward more consolidation. A lot of that is driven by the economics of how expensive it is to run so many different school buildings when you could consolidate it into fewer facilities. And there's also, as we'll talk about a little bit later, obviously been a transition in terms of where people live and more people moving out to these sort of suburban and exurban areas that require these longer distance trips. Now, I know you, Kelley, grew up in an area where you had integrated, integrated in the sense of geographic more than racial, but like consolidated school district for high school and so forth. Did you have to take the bus for that?
Yeah, I happened to just live on the same block as my elementary school, so was a walker, they called us. But for middle school and high school, I took the bus, as did anybody outside of a certain radius of the school.
But it's a huge, huge expense for many school districts to get this bus service provided for these kids. I feel like that has faded to the background as the debate over busing as an integration tactic has faded from sort of the spotlight. But it still is it's this huge expense that's such a big factor for so many school budgeting decisions all over the country. And that's true in the big city districts. It's true in the smaller suburban districts and so forth. So I was wondering if you could talk to us a little bit about kind of the state of how this bus service is provided currently in the United States to most of these school districts and kind of what the effects of that are.
Yeah, absolutely. Like you mentioned, getting kids to school every day is a huge feat if you really think about it at the national scale. And the truth is that our public transportation systems just aren't up to it, either because in suburban or rural areas there is no public transportation, or in areas with public transportation, they simply can't take, a 20 times increase in ridership at 7 o'clock a.m. when folks are trying to get to school. So it has long been assumed in many places that we need school buses, and that is just part of the cost of operating a school. I will say that it is not the case in some places like Washington, D.C., where students get free Metro cards and then are expected to sort of get themselves to school unless the student has a special need that requires them to be transported. But for the most part, in most school districts, the fact that we need school buses is just sort of a reality. Bellwether did a study a couple of years ago, and they found that there's, as of 2013, there was 480,000 buses being used each day, or almost 500,000 buses at the beginning of each day and each afternoon to bring kids to and from school. And I think what most people don't realize is that in an average, the average cost of student transportation per year for the school district was about $1,000 in 2015. And so when you talk about per pupil spending, you can sort of just on average, take $1,000 right off the top, and that goes right to transportation. And school districts go about this a bunch of different ways, as you can imagine. Some school districts own buses, and the bus drivers are employees of the school district, and they take sort of complete ownership over the process. Some districts contract out, and they just they pay a third party to operate the buses and maintain the buses and employ the drivers. And then, as you can imagine, there's about 1,000 degrees of gray in between those two options, with each school district really trying to figure out what's best for them. This bellwether study found that ideally the idea of what's supposed to be happening is that contracts for school busing sort of spread out the fixed costs of operating a bus service across multiple contracts. But in reality, it's just not always that simple. There is a lot of efficiency problems in getting students from point A to point B in a way that is both safe and efficient, and cost effective, but also doesn't require the kid to be on the bus an hour and a half early, those sorts of things. And as soon as the school district sells their buses and say, hey, we're going to use this contract, now the school district has almost no sort of leverage, because what are they going to do? Buy back a whole district worth of buses in a year? That just doesn't quite seem possible. So a lot of school districts are coming across these hidden costs and just very, very pricey school bus contracts. And specifically in New York City, the average cost per year in 2013 was $6,900 a child just for transportation. And so this is just like one very extreme example of what schools are up against. And these costs are sort of taken for granted, I think. People need buses. But I think in the current budget climate, and with schools across the country seeing cuts to their budget, people are going to have to take a closer look at this. So as school districts address budget shortfalls in the coming year, and maybe an opportunity to look at these school bus contracts and figure out a way to do what's best for students and hopefully save some money on the contracts, and also do right by the bus drivers, many of who were on contracts haven't been getting paid in COVID times, as they have not been working and transporting kids to school. And as this crisis drags on, and schools remain closed, their sort of own personal financial crises drag on as well. So I think it's an issue where there's sort of no neutral option in some ways, because you need buses, and so you need to figure out how to do that. And in any given option, you are balancing what's best for students and what's best for budgets, and what's best for bus drivers. And so trying to find the correct balance there is something that a lot of school districts will be wrestling with in the coming years.
Now, you looked at some of the data from a couple of the bigger states like Pennsylvania and New York, and found some interesting data there to talk about.
Yeah, the Keystone Research Center in Pennsylvania did some work a couple of years back and found that 72% of Pennsylvania school districts were contracting out their bus service in 2008, which had been, an increase in the past 20 years of districts who were not operating their buses but were instead contracting them out. And they found that in analyzing school district transportation costs, we control for the impact on costs of school district enrollment, fuel costs, spending for transportation of special education students, and the wealth and income of the school district. And they found that contracting out significantly increases total costs. Contracting out also increases the cost to the states. However, just because of the way sort of the laws and the funding works for the school districts, there wasn't a big difference in the cost of transportation services, whether they paid for them themselves or contracted them out, because the state had a more generous reimbursement process for contracts. So essentially it is cheaper overall for districts to run their own busing in Pennsylvania, but the state was sort of eating and covering the cost of those contracts, which is just another sort of level of complexity to this problem, is all of the funding formulas and the different funding sources that make education dollars sort of really hard to understand in the first place. And like I mentioned before, the New York City issue is, you could probably do a whole episode just on that. New York City has been in the press for a couple of years for having such expensive busing contracts. And that is largely because, according to this 2013 article, contracts hadn't been put out for bid since 1979. They had just been getting renewed and renewed. These busing companies essentially sort of get to sort of set their prices, and that is what the city pays. In 2008, the head of the bus drivers union was actually sent to jail for connections to the mob, which further complicates this story, of course. And these lucrative contracts don't appear to be benefiting drivers who they are paid for their summertime off, which is unusual in most school contracts, but as independent contractors, they haven't seen an increase in pay proportional to the increase in the cost of the contracts to the city. There have been sort of rumors flying around in the past couple of months about the New York City Department of Education buying school bus companies, which is concerning to the industry. But as you can imagine, those school bus companies on those contracts have not been seeing, have seen some of their revenue cut in the face of COVID, are in sort of a vulnerable position, and the city is talking about trying to buy them out and take more of an operational role in running the school buses. That is all sort of rumor that de Blasio has fed a couple of times, but nothing certain there. But I think it speaks to the fact that as cities look at their budgets in the coming years, this big line item of school buses, which has been sort of taken for granted for the past couple decades, may be something that school districts need to figure out how to do more efficiently.
So, some thoughts that I had here, and I think Nate may want to weigh in on this in just a second as well. To me, it feels like a lot of the school bus contracting stuff is just such a perfect microcosm of like the sort of marketization and outsourcing of many, many government functions. You get as you said, Kelley, there's often situations where they present themselves as saying, oh, we can do this cheaper, so you should outsource it. But then it turns out there's all these hidden costs, like, or various other things, like maybe they can offer a 1-year deal that's great, but then they realize that the school districts can't go back on this. Once, as you said, once you've sold the buses, you can't really turn that around very easily. And it's hard, unless you're a very big school district like New York City, to buy school bus companies and absorb those into your municipal government. So, they can say, oh, we'll give you a good deal for 1 year and then you're stuck with us. In many cases, I think there's often not that much competition. It's not much of a free market. You're lucky if you get 2 providers competing with each other for contracts. And of course, even if there is competition, they'll make the case that, well, you should stick with us because you're used to working with us, and this will be stability, and we have the drivers that you're used to, et cetera, et cetera. You know what you're getting. But in many cases, you'll have districts that only really have one option if they outsource it, and that means that there's really no competition there. And so there's certainly no way of making sure that your costs aren't going to explode out of control once you've outsourced it. And not to mention the fact that if you have a competitive situation where there's a competitive pressure to cut costs and to make a profit, there's always going to be that fear that it's coming at the expense of safety, whether it's equipment safety of the buses themselves, whether it's safety of, making sure you've done all the appropriate background checks on your drivers and so forth, or whatever, or that the drivers even just, they may be perfectly great people, but if they have unsafe labor conditions because of this particular for-profit environment, maybe they're at a disadvantage in terms of making sure they get enough sleep and making sure they have enough training and all these other sort of things that can lead to accidents. Although buses themselves are statistically quite safe, at least for the people riding them, sometimes there are fatalities involving other vehicles if there's a collision or something like that. But yeah, I don't know if you had thoughts on this, Nate, but it just seems to me like this is such a encapsulation of the overall trend of like, well, it's not the government's job to be running a bus company, or it's not the government's job to be, making food for the cafeteria. So we'll just outsource all of it. And then we get these various problems.
Yeah. And I mean, I'm just trying to think back to when we were in school. Did we have outsourced like lunches, or?
It got outsourced while we were in elementary school, I believe.
Okay.
Or
wow. Yeah.
possibly middle school, but yeah, it was around then.
And then the bus. I mean, yeah, as you're saying, this is very emblematic of everything we talked about with Lily Geismer and just the ongoing marketization and privatization of pretty much everything. So I guess we're seeing sort of how it all fits in and sort of how things got started. But yeah.
Yeah, and now, I mean, there were, I guess we can jump to the sort of historical dimensions of this. Originally the first places that had school buses, or even before the invention of, auto bus with rubber tires and all that, you'd have like wagons taking people to school in rural areas or whatever, things like that. So there's always been kind of a dimension of transportation in any situation where you weren't just taking people to the neighborhood school. And in fact, in many cases, school buses arose as part of a educational push, which I think we can all endorse, away from these rural one-room schoolhouses with all grades together, just because that's not very like educationally rigorous. And so, in order to transport them to larger school facilities and consolidated districts, you started having this push toward what eventually became school buses. But like then you have this other sort of situation separate from the rural context, where you have, as Kelley said, in the inner cities, you would often say, okay, the kids are either walking to a neighborhood school, or they're getting on a streetcar, or they're getting on the subway, or whatever. And that takes care of that for the most part, although there's certainly some exceptions, as we're seeing when we're talking about like New York City and so forth. But this post-war push out to the suburbs, the initial solution there, for if people weren't within walking distance of the school, in places like Newton, where Nate and I grew up, originally there was no school bus system. You would just like get on the MTA bus or whatever, what's now the MBTA, and that's how you would get to school. And it wasn't a special bus that was just for children. But again, as Kelley alluded to, that only works if the transportation system can absorb the number of kids that are jumping on at specific times of day. It also means that you have to have routes that go to the relevant places. And if neither of those things are true, then you're going to need to have a school bus system in the suburbs, and then out into the exurbs in, we're talking about, and as we have been last week, about the 128 corridor. That's a suburb. Those are in many cases, less sort of semi-rural than, say, where Kelley grew up, out past 495 in the exurbs and so forth. You're definitely going to need to have school buses to get people, to even potentially a different town in many cases, if you've consolidated it in the similar manner to what had happened with the rural busing. So this has been a long-standing sort of issue, but again, as Kelley said, in many cases, the schools would run the bus system themselves, and it was considered an appropriate role to have school buses running their own, school districts running their own school buses, because, as Kelley said, that's just taken as a given that it's part of your cost of having an education system is dealing with the transportation. But somewhere along the line, there was this big push to instead outsource many of these places. Now, I'm sure there were also places that went directly to the outsourced model to begin with, or at least let's say the school bus specific private provision of that, as opposed to like relying on the public transportation system. But in many cases, there were places that, at least for a period, had an in-house busing system, and then convinced themselves that it was going to be cheaper to outsource it to the private market. And then you can justify it as saying, well, they're the specialists in that. Those are the bus guys. They know how to run a bus system, so that's fine. And that is not necessarily, I would say, an accurate rendering of the picture, as we're seeing from the data looking at this. Back in, as I said, there was that 20th century transition that led to the rise of school buses in general in most of these rural areas, to deal with getting people out of the one-room all-grades model. But then by 1939, it was clear to a lot of people that there needed to be standardization, which is when you get the rise of the yellow school buses. This had already existed before 1939 in many districts, but it was not like an industry standard. And it's never been really officially really regulated per se. It's been kind of a voluntary national standard to go with the yellow, slightly orangey yellow school bus color. It's very high visibility, especially in peripheral vision. And then they, added things like the little arm that swings out to protect people and the little stop sign and things like that. And these were all measures that were meant to improve safety. A lot of this, though, has actually been around since 1939. Interestingly, apparently a lot of school districts that didn't have yellow before this standard was adopted tried to have their school buses be red, white, and blue as like a sort of patriotic thing, which I feel like that feels very What was the thing in AP U.S. history when they would talk about the like Republican motherhood and civic virtue concept from like the 1820s, where like the people would be like, we need to have public schools so they can teach people how to be like model citizens in our participatory representative democracy. I feel like the school bus in red, white, and blue goes with that. But anyway, the eventually this was adopted, and we have relative standardization. But it was interesting, the Smithsonian Magazine article, and as usual, all the notes on this will be up at arsenalfordemocracy.com in a PDF. But there was a Smithsonian Magazine article about this that describes the school bus transportation system as effectively the largest mass transit system in the United States. And they note, again, as I alluded to earlier, that statistically, they're like less than 1% of traffic fatalities each year, and generally, almost always, those are not people in the bus that are killed. It's people that run into a bus or get hit by a bus. But they're 70 times safer than traveling to school by car because they're so heavily regulated and designed for safety and so forth. That's something that we didn't really have a chance when we were doing the research to dig into that, but like there's definitely been this push lately, or like trend, or whatever you want to call it. It's not really a push. I don't know where it's coming from, but like a lot of people taking their kids to school in their own cars instead of using the bus system. I don't know if that's like a national thing, but that's definitely something that's true around where I am. And you know, maybe there's not enough bus. Maybe that's an indicator there's not enough bus service or something like that. That's something that I've definitely heard. Like, well, you know, this is a relatively short trip, so I'm on my way to work. I'll just do that. But that's not necessarily the safest way of getting your kid to school. There's also crowding issues. That was something that Nate and I dealt with when they introduced the bus pass system, where you had to pay, and that's another factor that we've actually talked about in city government meetings earlier this year. Is this notion of like, does requiring people to pay to ride the bus to school discourage them from actually taking the bus and encourage them to go toward the car route and so forth. But anyway, the other thing, though, of course, that is looming over this is what we talked about at the beginning of the episode, and that's what we want to go back to now. So after, you know, several decades after this, you know, 1939 standardization of buses and so forth, all of a sudden, buses become this fixture of something else, which is not just purely transportation beyond the local neighborhood to a larger school, but it's also this issue of integration that becomes this huge political hot potato. And as we said, some of that has come back up because of Harris being a kid who was bused to school for integration purposes, Biden being someone who opposed it, but it's also come up even in the U.S. Senate race in Massachusetts because of the time period that Ed Markey was coming up in, that, you know, he was apparently associated with some of the anti-busing people. But that is itself, as Nate's about to talk about, a bit of a debate at the time too, because it became increasingly difficult to distinguish between the people who were like, you know, inveterate racists who opposed school integration, who were hopping on the bandwagon and using that as a shield, versus people who maybe didn't have malicious intent, and it's harder to say, but they were just like, this is like, my kid lives next to the school. Why is the kid getting bused across the city or whatever? And it's always very difficult to kind of sort out like who was in it for the right reasons or not. I tend to think we all tend to lean toward being pretty skeptical of people, and I don't know what the situation was with Markey. He's definitely apologized for being associated with that. But Nate, could you talk to us a little bit about the busing crisis? I mean, we can talk about Boston specifically, but of course it was something that was happening more widely, and sort of the political dimensions of that at the time.
Yeah, I mean, there was a bit in Don't Blame Us that involved like these various anti-busing groups. One was called Roar, and they were like picketing outside of the home of the judge, Arthur Garrity in Wellesley. This is October 1974. And they were like, put Garrity on a bus, blah, blah, blah. And
yeah, because it was cross-busing within Boston, so the Boston protesters went out to the suburbs where the judge lived and were like, how come you don't send your kids to school in Boston?
Yeah, send Wellesley's children to Roxbury schools. So, and then another resident wrote across a newspaper clipping about an African-American man robbing a white woman. So this group, Restore Our Alienated Rights, Roar. And so these were... Of course, there was the violent confrontations as well, a lot of rock throwing. Wasn't it, too, then that, like, Stephen Lynch, another congressman, he, like, beat up some Iranian kids? But this was, like, also during the busing crisis? All sorts of crazy stuff happening in Massachusetts. But and then there's other stuff from Don't Blame Us, where they talk about how Voice and some of these other groups, they took control of the school board or school committee in Newton and basically tried to kill Metco because of funding shortfalls from the Dukakis governorship, which eventually got restored and Metco was saved. But then there was another incident with the Metro Trailways program, I believe it was called, and involving the Wobbin School, Bill, where you went to elementary school.
Ainger School in Wobbin.
And it was basically going to be a program about exploring Charles River ecology between children at Ainger and also the David A. Ellis School in Roxbury. And they were going to meet about 10 times for 2 hours between mid-March and June. And they were going to go to the Museum of Science and other things like that. And basically, it was supported by the parents at Ainger and basically by a lot of people in city government, but there was a backlash by anti-busing parents. Are we going to pay Newton taxes to have some of my children educated in other parts of the greater Boston school district? And a lot of this, there was racialized anxiety about urban crime and drugs and the overall dangers of the city. And Ainger principal Roland Barth was quoted in the book saying, "I certainly don't want to accuse anyone of being a racist, but if we were planning the program with an elementary school in Wellesley, I don't think you would have seen the sort of concern about not enough basic education. There's a hell of a lot of fear in the unknown." And then there are some other rather more pointed quotes from Black representatives from Roxbury, Mel King, basically saying we should, paraphrasing what he thought the attitude of the white suburbanites was, basically say, put the Black kids back in their place. We've done too much for them. So that was sort of these are the very localized crises that are happening here. But we could probably do a whole episode on the Boston busing crisis generally, or what was all happening during that point as well. So
could you talk though about the political people that like used the busing thing as a cover for their existing racial animus?
Right. So this is another quote from, and there's a couple articles that we pulled up, and a couple of these historians have done some good work on busing, including one, this guy, Matt Delmont, professor of history at Dartmouth College, who wrote a book like Why Busing Failed. And but basically, people started recognizing that once with these groups like ROAR, and these were all over the country, but once you started, if your goal was to actually oppose integration, but you couldn't really say that out loud without being called a racist, then if you start talking like about opposing busing, then all of a sudden you can launder your beliefs. So there's an LA Assemblyman, Floyd Wakefield, said in 1970, said, "I've talked with about before 500 or 600 groups over the last years about busing. Almost every time someone has gotten up and called me a racist or a bigot. But now all of a sudden I am no longer a bigot. Now I am called a leader of the anti-busing effort." And then it goes on to say why parents and politicians frame their resistance to school desegregation in terms like busing and neighborhood schools. And this rhetorical shift allowed them to support white schools and white neighborhoods without using explicitly racist language.
Now, Kelley, you had commented before we started recording about like how some of the context piece was lost here, because I feel like a lot of the discussion around the politics of the busing debate and everything is like people associate that with the 70s, but of course it goes back to, Brown v. Board in the 1950s. Like this was something that built up over a long period, and I think it's important that we go back to kind of the beginning and have like understand how we got from point A to point B on that.
Yeah, and I think probably the clearest way to represent that is in a case out of Prince Edward County. And remember now, like this really a conversation about desegregation, and busing is just one policy to achieve desegregation. And so Prince Edward County in 1959 actually opted to close all of their schools rather than integrate them. And what they did was they created private schools and then supported those private schools via tuition grants from the county government, but did that only for white students. And the schools did not fully reopen until 1964 when the Supreme Court ruled against their tuition grant scheme. And many Black students missed out on 5 whole years of education. So I think this story just really highlights how impassioned people were about the charge of desegregation in the efforts to desegregate. And then, like Nate has pointed out, 15 or 20 years later, when we talk about busing, that gives people a way to oppose desegregation without talking about race. And I think the one other important piece to point out is that from an educational standpoint, busing or desegregation is widely accepted to be a good thing. It supports the students from the community outside of the school in a sense that they have better academic gains. It supports the students at the school where children are coming into because it's been shown to reduce racial bias and lead to better life outcomes, even if the academic outcomes are similar. And I think that this sort of like conversation about the politics and sort of almost like the communication aspects of busing sort of neglects to mention that in general, like desegregation is a really positive thing for students. The one party that it is not generally positive for are teachers of color. Research has shown that there was a huge decrease in the number of teachers of color after Brown v. Board of Education, and sort of in the decades since then, as we desegregate, it often means that we lose our Black teachers, many of whom are often overqualified for their teaching position, especially historically speaking. A Black person with a PhD in the 60s couldn't necessarily get the job they wanted and would often end up teaching. And then to lose those as schools were desegregated because white parents did not want their children educated by Black educators was a huge hit to the teaching community. But students, as far as education outcomes and as far as student outcomes, desegregation is widely considered to be an important tool in education.
Now, Nate said, a couple minutes ago, he was quoting one historian who kind of casually referred to busing as a failure. But I mean, how do we think of what is sort of the consensus on the legacy of it? Like, did it achieve its goals in terms of integration? Was it sort of abandoned without accomplishing? Like, what is sort of how should we think about this now?
Yeah, I don't think about it in terms of the policy being a failure. But I do sort of think about it as the outcome being a victory for parents who did not want schools desegregated, if that makes any sense. I don't think that the policy has been implemented in enough places with real fidelity to really be able to measure whether it's a good policy. I think rather it has been the removing of race from the conversation of busing has allowed parents who oppose desegregation, whether consciously or unconsciously, to preserve their schools as sort of single race schools. So I just don't know that there's enough about the policy. I think that it's something that we haven't done a very good job of practicing with fidelity. I think that the other thing is that by many measures, our schools are as segregated today as they were at the time of Brown v. Board of Education. Our neighborhoods, our housing all remain segregated. So unless you can find a way to desegregate housing or move students so that they're not going to school where they live, our schools will continue to remain segregated. So I think by those measures, the policy did not achieve what it set out to, but whether that is because it is a bad policy or because it was not implemented with fidelity because of political pressures, I think is the question.
Right, and obviously, as you said, the housing dimension of that can't be overlooked. Like, in some ways, people have some valid complaints about like putting their kids on buses or whatever if they were, well, why should they have to go somewhere else? But like, and it becomes difficult to sort out who's being sincere about that and who's just using it as cover to be super racist. But then like you zoom out further from that and say, well, it doesn't even really matter because the issue is the housing, and the housing policy has if not racist current policy, definitely a racist history that led to where things are. So even if redlining is no longer officially a policy, you still get the long-term, very long tail effects of redlining. And then something that we talked about in last week's episode with Lily Geismer, and some of the things that we didn't talk about in the episode but come up in the book, is this notion around like if the people who do move in to racially integrate these areas tend to be of the same class as the people who are already there. So that doesn't really, even you can racially get close, somewhat more integration without really addressing even the fundamental underlying thing, which is about resource allocation and distribution. Because of course that's at the heart of things like Brown v. Board of Education to begin with. Is it's not just abstractly we need white kids and black kids to go to school together. It's that we haven't figured out how to equitably distribute educational resources. And I say we haven't figured out as shorthand for they were making conscious decisions to not do it. But from a policy standpoint, to address that inequity, we keep circling back to this issue of like, okay, so is busing the way to fix this? Can we come up with a way of equitably and equally funding these different school systems so that people can still go to school near where they are, but this time the schools are equally funded? Is that even possible? Because the part where I say when we can't figure out how to do it gets into issues like in places like Massachusetts, where you have a property tax system that's locally funding the school system. There's some educational grant funding from the state education department to try to level fund things, except that it's not. It's like equity. It's supposed to be equity funding, but then if the cities that are richer can do more property taxes and fund above and beyond the foundation levels, then they're still going to come out ahead. So, how do you figure out, like, what is the actual solution? Because maybe busing isn't the answer. Maybe there was something else that would have been the better answer, like the abstract ideal way, to get back to your point about implementing things with political fidelity, abstractly, unless your goal was itself that the schools needed to have X number of percentage of black kids and white kids or any other race, then the goal is that the reason for doing the integration is like, unless they're integrated and there's white kids going to all these schools, then they're not going to get the resources that they need to run a proper education system. But abstractly, you could hypothetically come up with a way where you did give everyone that, if there were no political considerations and no political opposition, you could say we're committing to giving equal funding to every single district based on population or something like that. But that is like so abstract that it's like now we're getting into like really weird fuzzy territory that's just not really connected to reality either.
Yeah. Bill, and just to echo what you're saying, like, I think we have to be really careful about the way we talk about this, because why does a student of color have to spend 45 minutes on the bus in order to get, the best education? That's like, we're asking students to compensate for the failure of adults over, the past 400 years to equitably fund our communities. And so I think that is just a really important point you raised, that if the point is to provide a high quality education for every student, then there must certainly be different ways to achieve that.
And I mean, we're about to talk about Delaware, and Nate's going to talk about that, and Biden specifically. But like, I know from the geography program at University of Delaware, one of the big debates about integration as a whole, not just school integration, but integration as a whole in Delaware, rolling back various Jim Crow things and things like that, because Delaware was, one of the southern states, the border states, along with Maryland. The black neighborhood, like there was in Newark, Delaware, where University of Delaware is, there was a vibrant black neighborhood with black-owned businesses and, a successful emerging black middle class that was accumulating wealth and so forth. You had a factory nearby, an auto plant that employed a ton of unionized middle class black workers. All of that is gone, and this is something you can see all over the rest of the country. The disappearance of that is traced not to like some cataclysmic riot that destroyed this community or whatever. It is traced directly to the integration policies that suddenly brought in competing white businesses or various other forces that destroyed these neighborhoods, and it was like, oh, well, we can't have a black specific neighborhood anymore, so we're going to come in and we're going to buy up all the land for the university to have or whatever. That is something that happened all over the country, and it goes back to that fundamental question, which is like, well, is the goal integration for its own sake, or is it providing like total equity? And this is like, I'm not here to obviously say like, oh, we shouldn't have done integration, because that would be a weird position to take. But like, it is, from a historical standpoint and from an economic and material standpoint, it's important to ask these questions of like, did we actually fix the problems we were attempting to fix with the inequities that were built into our society? Or did we simply make a bunch of black kids have to get on the bus for 45 minutes, meanwhile being, verbally abused and yelled at, or having rocks thrown at them or whatever, and, or having to be escorted into college campuses and elementary school campuses in Arkansas? Did we accomplish the goals of equity for those people? Or did we just completely like open the floodgates for a bunch of white investors to wipe out, a black middle class community that was formed and so forth, and destroy the local school that had been built up, instead of just saying, let's provide more funding for these local schools? It's a tough conundrum and paradox to deal with, because obviously, like, racial segregation, nobody's going to, setting aside racists, nobody's going to defend that as like, oh, that was this great halcyon thing. Like, the emergence of these self-sustaining black middle-class communities was a direct result of the fact that they weren't getting any help from anyone else. So they had to come up with their own banks and their own businesses and that sort of thing. And so that, like, again, goes back to that inequity issue. But at the same time, like, it doesn't seem like the policies that were adopted to fix the problems that were real about those actually fixed those problems. It seems like it in many cases made it worse. But Nate, could you talk a little bit more about Biden specifically, because he was a really significant person in the debate on busing, coming from this sort of white suburban northern Delaware background?
Yeah, so basically, apparently he actually started his career sort of like supporting integration, supporting busing, just sort of generally, right? But apparently his constituents basically becomes like, he starts reversing on it and becomes an active leader in the anti-busing movement, and is, as we've talked about, starts making alliances with extremely racist segregationist senators and such, and becomes basically a leader in the anti-busing movement, as we talked about earlier. So, yeah, we could go into some of the various amendments and stuff. There was some journalism that was done last year about this because of the whole thing with Kamala Harris in the debate, and there were some letters picked up, basically reviewed by CNN, that he was writing to other senators, I guess, to try to court them. So in one letter, he says, "My bill strikes at the heart of the injustice of court-ordered busing. It prohibits federal courts from disrupting our educational system in the name of the Constitution, where there is no evidence that governmental officials intended to discriminate. I believe there is growing sentiment in Congress to curb unnecessary busing." This is March 25th, 1975. This was his first term in the Senate, and he was getting the support of James Eastland, chairman of the Judiciary Committee, and very anti-desegregation guy, viewed blacks as, quote, an inferior race. But Biden was writing to the chairman, "Dear Mr. Chairman, I want you to know I very much appreciate your help during this week's committee meeting in attempting to bring my anti-busing legislation to the vote." And so he had a variety of different legislations and amendments and stuff that we could go over. Sometimes it was to block I believe it was Department of Education for using any funding to examine the busing issue, I believe, or it would bar the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare from collecting data about the race of students or teachers, and then also prevented the department from requiring schools to classify teachers or students by race. And basically, he worked with Jesse Helms on this, and they proudly announced that the measure would effectively end any federal oversight or enforcement of busing. I have come to believe that busing is a bankrupt concept, Biden said, as he supported Helms' amendment. So there's a lot of stuff here. There's some stuff from this University of New Hampshire historian Jason Sokol, basically saying that once Biden saw his constituents were angry, he fashioned a politically expedient stance where he could claim he supports integration while opposing busing, which was the actual means to bring that integration. So later, basically, apparently also, and I didn't know this, he really angered, with this amendment, he angered Republican Senator Edward Brooke here in Massachusetts, who was the only black senator at the time in Congress, and I believe the only black senator since Reconstruction. And Brooke called the Biden amendment the greatest symbolic defeat for civil rights since 1964. So he was very active in all of this. I mean, and the Biden campaign has tried to quibble with certain details here. It's, he only didn't support one type of busing, but other types of busing he was okay with. So, but as we learned from Kamala Harris, apparently all this doesn't really matter now. So it's all gravy. We're moving on.
All right, Kelley, your closing thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think that this conversation sort of emphasizes a larger question that I spend a lot of time thinking about, which is like, do we expect schools to sort of solve all of the ills in our communities? Are we okay with students of color getting bused 45 minutes and then returning home to a community that doesn't have access to healthcare, doesn't have a grocery store? But have we, like, quote unquote, fixed it if we meet some sort of ratio in the schools? And so I think this is a question about equity that goes far beyond the school day.
And I think that's sort of one of the themes of the book that Nate and I were interviewing the author about last week with Don't Blame Us, is that the suburban approach that has come to dominate the Democratic Party since the late 1960s is really emphasizes this idea that, like, all problems in society will be solved with educational opportunity. Like, any problem you can think of is either going to be fixed by a market-based solution in public-private partnership or by the schools fixing all of the sins of the past with each new generation. And that just seems like a really unrealistic burden to put on schools. And I think is a much bigger burden than the question of, as we talked about at the beginning of the episode, should school districts be providing their own bus transportation or should they be outsourcing it? Like, that is... that is a big picture question that is a question of, is there too much of a burden put on the school systems? And I think the answer is, in many cases, as Kelley said, yes, because you're not fixing the actual underlying problems of the twin inseparable problems in the United States of racism and the forces of capital. So, Kelley, thank you so much for being on the show this week and for all this research.
Thanks for having me, Bill.
And Nate, thanks for being on as well.
Great to be on.